This is critical thinking on the appendicular muscles lab, and here are the questions where you're looking at synergists and antagonists. Here you have to identify actions and attachments of a muscle, and this is again talking about identifying muscles and then naming an antagonist of a particular muscle. Now let's go to this first question, which asks you at which joints do muscles A and B act as synergists, and name one antagonist of muscle A. So first, the most important thing to do is identify whether this is the anterior portion, and we obviously can see it's the forearm. You have to identify whether this is the anterior portion of the forearm and or the posterior portion. Now this is the anterior portion of the forearm. Notice how you have so many small muscles here. There's this fleshy thenar eminence, the hypothenar, and then we have all the tiny muscles in between. And just to show you a picture of the posterior aspect of the forearm. Look at this. This is the posterior aspect of the forearm and the hand. So notice how the tendons are passing through, how they are connected to each other here. Also notice you don't have much fleshy bellies in between. You also see the different muscles present here. So having identified that this is the anterior aspect of the forearm, this also you now need to know, be able to identify these muscles. So let's look at this first muscle A, which arises from this portion. That's why this white line is shown, to show that these are two separate muscles. So it arises from here, which is the radius. Follow this tendon, it goes all the way to the distal phalanx of the thumb. So therefore it is a pollicis. It crosses this joint anteriorly and is on the anterior aspect in the palm. So this muscle is the flexor pollicis longus. So let's look at B. B arises from the ulna, from this portion, crosses the wrist joint anteriorly, goes into the palm where it's going to the distal phalanx of the medial 4 digits. So this is the flexor digitorum profundus. Now, they are crossing the wrist joint anteriorly, so hence they will act on the wrist joints together, and they'll be synergists. Since they cross it anteriorly, they will cause flexion of the joint. So we've identified this as flexor pollicis longus, flexor digitorum profundus. We know that they cross the wrist joint, so they will act on the wrist joint as synergists, and while it's not asked, we know that they'll cause flexion. So therefore the first choice is wrong, because you can see they are not crossing the elbow, so this is wrong. So the second, so then let's look at these choices. So yes, it does cross the wrist joint. So all three give it as wrist joint. So this part of the question is right. But let's see the second part of the question, which asks you to identify an antagonist of muscle A. So we've said this is flexor pollicis longus. So obviously this answer could not be right, because it's not. Flexor pollicis longus is the muscle. You need to identify what is the antagonist of this muscle. So this wouldn't be a correct answer to this question. Let's look at the third choice, which says flexor carpi ulnaris. Now this choice is given if, and this would be correct, if this muscle was flexor carpi radialis, because flexor carpi radialis causes abduction at the wrist joint, and flexor carpi ulnaris causes adduction at the wrist joint. So just to show you what flexor carpi radialis and ulnaris would look like. So you can see here A is flexor carpi radialis. So A is flexor carpi radialis. And so we see A is flexor carpi radialis and B is flexor carpi ulnaris. So you can see they are very superficial, and these muscles end up here just beyond the wrist. So the muscle that is shown here goes right up to the thumb. So obviously it's not flexor carpi radialis. So hence flexor carpi ulnaris would not be one of the choices you have for this question. And the last choice, which says wrist joint, that means they are synergists at the wrist joint. This part is correct. And extensor pollicis longus would be its antagonist. So therefore this is the correct answer to this question. Let's look at the next one, which asks you, what are the actions of the muscle the arrow points to, and what are its proximal and distal attachments? Now again, we can see you need to first identify whether this is the front or the anterior aspect of the leg or the posterior aspect. This is the anterior aspect because you can see that here is the patella and here is the foot, and you can see the dorsum of the foot and the nails on the toes. So any muscle crossing in front of the ankle joint will cause dorsiflexion. So therefore this would not be a choice. So we have to look at these three choices. Now let's look first, identify and look at this muscle here to know its attachments. So you can see this muscle ends here, this tendon of this muscle ends here where the tarsal bones are, and it begins here, and this is the tibia. So it begins on the tibia and ends up here. So hence if you look at this choice which says fibula and distal phalanx of big toe, so let's say even if you thought it arose from the fibula, this tendon is ending here. It's this next tendon which the arrow is not pointing to, which goes to the distal phalanx of the big toe, and that's extensor hallucis. So this would not be a choice because you can see quite obviously that the tendon's ending here. So let's look at the third choice, which is dorsiflexion. Yes, this muscle is a dorsiflexor and it is attached to the anterior aspect of the tibia and the tarsal bones, which is here because this happens to be the tibialis anterior. However, let's look at the last. So this is the correct answer. Let's look at the last choice, which says dorsiflexion, and then it says femur and tarsal bones. You can see from this that this muscle obviously is not arising from the femur. The femur is way up over here. This muscle is arising from this part, so it's arising from the tibia. So therefore, this also would not be an obvious choice, and hence this is the correct answer to this question. Let's look at the last question, which asks you to identify an antagonist of muscle A and then identify muscle B. So you can see this is the posterior aspect of the neck and the shoulder area. This muscle you see here is the trapezius, and then the muscle B, if you look here, this muscle is the rhomboid major because this is the levator scapulae. This small muscle here is the rhomboid minor, and this is rhomboid major. Now it asks you to identify the antagonist of trapezius. So if you look at the trapezius, it crosses the cervical spine posteriorly, so it will cause extension of the neck. And its other actions would be when both muscles act together, they also raise the shoulders up, as in shrugging. So they cause shrugging of the shoulders. So anything which causes flexion of the neck or brings the shoulder back to its original position would be its antagonist. So let's see the choices that we have here. So the first one is levator scapulae. And if you look at levator scapulae, which is this muscle here, when it contracts, it will pull the scapula up, and as the name itself suggests, levator means it pulls the scapula up. So it will also help in shrugging of the shoulders, so it cannot be an antagonist. So this part is wrong. And then if you look at the second part, which identifies muscle B as teres major, that is also wrong because this muscle here is teres major. So it's very important for you to be able to identify these muscles. So that's wrong. Let's look at the next choice, which says sternocleidomastoid and rhomboid major. This is the correct answer because trapezius crosses the cervical spine posteriorly, whereas sternocleidomastoid is present on the front of the neck, and that causes, so you can see in this picture, it crosses the front of the cervical spine, it crosses it anteriorly. So when muscles of both sides contract, they'll pull the mandible closer to the sternum and hence flex the cervical spine. So since trapezius causes extension, any muscle which flexes the spine, cervical spine, would be an antagonist. So this is correct. So the first part of the question is correct. So let's look at the second part, where this muscle's been identified as rhomboid major, which it is. So therefore this is the correct answer to this question. However, let's look at the other choices also. So we look at deltoid. Now deltoid causes abduction. The anterior fibers cause flexion at the shoulder joint and the posterior fibers cause extension at the shoulder joint. So they act on the shoulder joint. However, trapezius doesn't act on the shoulder, shoulder joint. It just acts on the scapula. And it, as I said, it causes those movements. So deltoid is not one of the choices. And the second is identifying muscle B, which is pectoralis minor. Pectoralis minor is present on the anterior aspect of the chest, and just to show you that, here, this is pectoralis minor. This muscle here is pectoralis minor, and the arrow is pointing to the serratus anterior. So this muscle here is the pectoralis minor, and the arrow here is pointing to serratus anterior. They're both present on the anterior aspect of the chest wall, so hence the identification is wrong in the third choice. So this is not one of the answers. So this is also wrong. And then it says antagonist of muscle A is trapezius. This muscle itself is trapezius, so this couldn't be one of the answers, which is why it's very important to read the question carefully. It's not asking you to identify the muscle, but asking you to identify an antagonist. So this is not the correct answer. And as I showed you earlier, this is not serratus anterior, so obviously this also is not one of the choices. So that's how you're going to answer these questions.